agriculture is supposed to be deeper than business, timeless, a lifestyle that harkens back where we can finally unplug from the modern hustle and bustle and phone calls and constant paperwork and obligations like paying bills. Hear me out. It is good for farms to be profitable. If you're running a farm, financial literacy on agriculture is a must. So if you want to start a farm, already have one, or just want to understand what the heck is going on in agriculture, this video is for you. You wouldn't think it's good for farms to stay afloat financially would need a hear me out, but I've been having a lot of conversations with farmers and people who have family land lately. And when I talk about the financial side of it, a lot of people get low-key scandalized, offended that I would think that they would think money is important, because farming shouldn't be about money. It's sacred. I'm getting this from people all over the political and spiritual spectrum. There's no one group of people I'm hearing it from. At least here in the US, it's pretty baked into the culture at large. You might also think, oh, this video must be for small farms, hobby farms, gentleman farmers. It's so nice that she's making something for the little guy. And yes, as a small farmer myself, I definitely have an eye on small-scale farm finances. But I've also worked with farms of all sizes to be more sustainable, including financially, for over a decade. Here in North Carolina, one of the biggest, most conventional big boy farm families in the state, running over 20,000 acres of land, is getting repoed by their bank right now. Because with all the resources they had on hand, apparently they were not running at a profit either. Of course, I can't know everything going on with that operation, but from what info is available, and from my experiences with large farms in general, I'm comfortable saying everyone can benefit from some real talk about farms and money. So, if you're a small farmer, if you're a big farmer, if you're a consumer or policymaker trying to make sense of how agriculture even works, this video's got something for you. Financial literacy about agriculture is for everybody. Also, in agriculture, we can get a kind of perfectionism. If we feel like we can't grow something perfect right away, we don't want to do it at all. So one of the things I work with my farmers on the most is, if we need to try something new to upgrade our revenue, it's okay to be bad at it at first. It's okay. Let's start small. If we try a new crop and it doesn't work out so well, instead of giving up, let's troubleshoot. I always say when we try something new, it's like making pancakes. The first one is always hideous. Don't freak out. Just start small and keep going. So with that in mind, welcome to my lovely set. I've been running around telling people it's okay to try new things and be messy. Meanwhile, this is my first video essay, and I'm still working on lighting, making a proper set in my house where I live. So I've been working with farms on profitability for over a decade one-on-one, and this is my first time doing videos about it on YouTube. So please bear with me as I live my values, embrace imperfection, and learn as we go. I hope the info in this video will be useful for you. So, why is financial literacy so underrated in agriculture? Well, I think it comes down to, throughout history, most of the farmers who have had the time to write books about agriculture were pretty well off. They made their money on books instead of the farm, or they had some other business supporting them. Of course, the farm making money did not feel very urgent to them. I think that's where we get a lot of this idea that agriculture is supposed to be deeper than business, timeless, a lifestyle that harkens back where we can finally unplug from the modern hustle and bustle and phone calls and constant paperwork and obligations like paying bills. Well, guess what? That attitude is how we wind up not paying the bills and having to sell the farm off to the highest bidder, usually a much larger farm operation or a housing developer. And that's not very traditional or sustainable or respectful to the ancestors' legacy, now is it? So that's why I believe that it's okay to treat a farm like a business. In fact, it's often better for the farmer's pocketbook, obviously, but also for sustainability. Now, treating farms like a business has a bad rap, and there are real reasons for that. Agriculture is famous for how it can be a little bit much sometimes. Farming so that you have clean water, healthy soil, and good pay so people can afford to do the work. None of that stuff is free, is it? It all costs money. So to farm well, you gotta start by making money. And that's why treating a farm like a business can actually help a lot with sustainability. In my experience working with hundreds of farms, when they get messy, it's not because somebody woke up one morning and said, hey, I want to run a dirty farm for profit. That's not what happens. Usually what does happen, folks didn't think about making money enough. They get into financial trouble and then they start cutting corners. By the time you realize you've got a problem, you're already in a downward financial spiral, and it is tough to invest and redo things and get out. That's why it is so important that we talk about money in agriculture. A little introduction before we dig in. I'm Sarah Tabor. I am a small farmer who works with farms of all sizes to make better income and be more sustainable, and I've done that for over a decade. I did not get born into a family with land, so I worked my way up in manual labor. That will give you a real appreciation for how the money part of agriculture is not a joke. When I talk about money in agriculture, that's where I'm coming from. Farming is not just about legacy. It is also about the work we put in today, keeping an eye on the future and being responsible to all the people who rely on us. So let's talk about why it's good to think of a farm, no matter what size it is, as a business. First, let's talk about what I mean by making money. It should be simple, but people can mean very different things when they say making money. So we'll talk about farm profitability, different ways to get there, and dealing with with risk. Then let's talk about some of the farmers who taught me a lot about running a good farm. Every farmer and farm worker has people in our lives that we learn from. Sometimes what to do, sometimes what not to do. I learned from these folks that running a farm that treats people and the environment right starts with running a good, strong, financially viable business. And I want to share their stories with you. So let's talk making money. This is business 101, right? Profit is your revenue, your income, minus your costs, right? Here's all the money you made selling crops or livestock or what have you. Here's all the costs, like the money it took you to grow those things. You subtract the costs from the money you made. That's your profit. That's what's left over, right? For most farms, profit is how the farmer gets paid. So if you want to afford to keep farming, profit is not a dirty word. You have to make some. Don't worry, we will get into bad business behavior in a moment. It is very real. But before we go there, here's why it's really important for a farm to make some profit. And if you've been scared to think of the idea of farms being profitable or think profit is a dirty word, it's time to rethink that. First, we all have bills to pay. You have got to pay those bills to afford to keep farming, right? Someday you'll probably want to retire from farming. Even if you don't want to retire from farming, your health will probably make you. You still have bills to pay when you're retired, and if you didn't save enough money while farming to pay those retirement bills, guess what happens then? You've got to sell the farm. That is often what happens. It's where a lot of farmers are at right now. That's why so many farms are getting sold to hedge funds and housing developers. It's so easy to blame all these farms getting sold on kids these days just don't want to farm. But that ignores a really big financial reality. It's not about want. An awful lot of kids these days absolutely do want to farm, and they can't afford to. We can't afford to take on a farm that loses money or barely breaks even. A young person who needs to make a living cannot afford to take on a money pit of a farm. So if we want farms to keep farming, good financial health is mandatory. I don't think we should have to spell this out, but if a farm is gonna last, profit is required. Now, let's talk different approaches to making money. When it comes to making sure you make some profit, here's how a lot of people try to do it. You just kind of, get rid of some of that, cut our costs way down. If we just cut our costs way down, then your profit can be a lot larger, right? That's how a lot of folks are trying to make that work. Now, there are definitely times that cost cutting works. If you've got big, expensive equipment that doesn't get used enough to pay for itself, sell that thing, free yourself. It sounds a little silly, but a lot of farms do get bogged down into debt by overbuying on equipment or vehicles that they don't use enough to justify the cost. It happens so often, we have a name for it. We call it heavy metal poisoning. The specifics of what kind of equipment a farm needs to do all its jobs are very individual. I could do a whole bunch of videos just on that, but bottom line, if a farm has some extra in that area, some extra equipment, cutting it loose is a great way to get profitability back on track. It frees up your finances and it doesn't hurt anybody. It's fantastic. Other ways to cut costs can have more consequences. For most businesses that want to cut costs, they always seem to go right to labor first. They want to pay people less, do the same work with fewer people, or both. And let's be honest, folks, the results are never good. When a store understaffs, the lines are forever long, cashiers start wearing diapers because they can't go on bathroom break, and you can't even find the things that you came to buy as a customer because the aisles and shelves are a mess. When agriculture understaffs, we get a lot of the issues that agriculture gets infamous for. When there aren't enough people to do a job right and on time or use a buddy system, you get accidents that can be fatal. A lot of livestock mistreatment comes down to not enough people managing too many animals. And low wages in agriculture comes with its own whole host of issues, many of which I've been blessed to experience firsthand. I think this version of cost cutting right here is why so many people are scared to think of agriculture as a business. We have a lot of businesses out there that are just badly run. So that's what we hear when we hear business. We hear poorly run business. We think race to the bottom. But guess what? There are no laws saying we have to do it that way. There are a lot of businesses that treat people right and are still really competitive. Costco and Quick Trip are just two examples. And I've also worked with a lot of farmers who do things similarly. They do things right and they make good money because they were farming well. I'm excited to talk about some of them later in this video. The bottom line is treating people badly and making a mess, that's just one way to cut costs. There are better ways to cut costs, and cutting costs is just one way to grow your profit. So let's talk about the other way to boost profits besides cutting costs, and that is grow your revenue. Here's your revenue and your everything. If you can make more of this, your costs stay the same. You're gonna have more profit, okay? Bottom line, if you can get your revenue also to grow faster than your costs, that's another great way to boost your profits. Now, how to grow a farm's revenue? There are a lot of different ways to approach it. And for today, let's just take the most basic approach, supply and demand. One great way to make more money and more revenue is to grow things that are in higher demand. So here's something really wild. Different crops make different amounts amounts of money, drastically different amounts of money. I'm going to do a whole video on this, but check out this chart. You will see that things like hay and wheat and soy and corn that are the most widely grown by the most farmers make the least money. Why do these different things make different amounts of money? Is it because some things are harder to grow? Yes, it is. How do I pick which crops are a good fit for me and my farm? If you want to see a video on that when it comes out, hit subscribe so you don't miss it. The bottom line for this video is just that farmers have a lot more control over how much money we make than we might think we do. Now, crops that make more money, again, there is a reason for that. It's because they're harder to grow. They take more effort, more labor, and more investment up front. That's how business works, isn't it? You invest more time and money and effort now to get a payoff later. That is how business works. And that is why it helps so much to think of a farm as a business. It helps us remember that it's a thing that we can invest in to get better results for ourselves. That does mean that to grow your profits by growing revenue, you do have to start by spending more money. That's called investment. And because these are higher dollar crops that are more work and expense to grow every year, your costs annually will also grow. It is our job as business owners to know our business and make smart investments so that the money we put into our operation really goes to work. Our costs will grow, but our revenue should grow even faster. That's investment. That is also where the risk comes in to treating a farm like a business. So it's time to talk about risk. What if you spend all this money and time into growing something new, into a different crop, to upgrading your farm, and it doesn't work out? Then what? The good news is farmers have a lot of ways to handle risk. Just a couple examples, we can start small, right? So we get experience with a new crop or livestock and start building a customer base without having to bet the whole farm on it. We can borrow, share, or rent tools. We don't have to buy the major equipment just to get started on a lot of things. In the US where I live, there are even special government assistance programs for farms that cover business losses. You don't have to have a disaster or a crop failure. They'll pay you out just when the prices are low. And US farmers don't even have to pay the full price for that insurance coverage because the taxpayer covers most of it. So farming has a reputation for being very risky, at least here in the United States, and that reputation of risk can make it very scary to try new things. But there is a lot that farmers can do to manage our own risk. And in the United States, there's also a lot of government support. That means Americans tend to perceive agriculture as being much more risky than it really is. And that can make people afraid of investing in their farm, even if we really need to, because of that perception of risk. And now that we're talking about profitability and risk on farms, let's talk about the single biggest risk of all, and that is the risk of doing nothing. If it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? This is often what that looks like for a farm. A lot of people who find themselves in this situation will just keep doing this because we might not be making any money, but at least we're not losing our shirt. So maybe we can just keep doing this forever, right? No. Here's the problem. Your costs will keep growing. Even if you just keep doing the same exact thing every single year, your costs will keep growing. Fuel, fertilizer, labor, and especially the value of land, so your property taxes or your rent, those tend to grow faster than the cost of inflation, at least some of the time, land value almost all the time. So even if you keep doing exactly the same thing every single year, your costs will keep growing. There is no such thing as staying steady in just about any business. If you stay put, you're falling behind. Now, if you invest in your farm to try and grow your revenue, yeah, there's a chance it won't work. That's always a possibility. But if you do nothing to strengthen your business for years and years and years, you will definitely lose money. That's the risk of doing nothing. And it's the single biggest risk that I run into when I'm out working with farmers in the US. But I also got lucky to work with some really savvy and skilled farmers who do treat their farms like a business. That has helped their farms survive when a lot of their neighbors went out of business. It didn't make these farmers take shortcuts like treating workers badly or the environment badly. In fact, because they treated their farms like a business, they could afford to do those things right. Treating farms like a business can be so helpful for overcoming a lot of the very real problems that farms experience. So let's get into it. Let's talk about a couple farmers who taught me a lot about how taking yourself seriously as a business helps with all the other parts of farming. Both of these farms started out as very small family farms. Other than that, they don't have much in common. One's a fruit orchard in Washington state that's still pretty small acreage-wise. The other one does onions down in southern Georgia and grew into larger acreage. I met both of these farms years ago, and at the time, their neighbors thought they were pretty weird because they ran their farms differently than their neighbors do. By the way, I'm going to use pseudonyms to protect privacy, but the fun thing about agriculture is if you work in those areas, you're still going to know exactly who I'm talking about, so be nice. Anyway, today, close to a decade later, the orchard in Washington state is now one of the last independent family farms in their entire valley. All those neighbors who made fun of them, well, guess who wasn't making money? Their kids could not afford to take the places on. So to retire out, the current generation of farmers had to sell the land. And guess who the only serious buyers were? It was hedge funds and housing developers. That left Mike and Carol Chilton as one of the only family farms still running in their area because decades ago, they said, hey, we're a business and we should act like one. But before we deep dive into them, let's talk about the Georgia Onion Farm. The Georgia onion farm and I met back in 2016. 5 years later, in 2021, their neighborhood had the biggest human trafficking bust in the United States' 21st century. It was called Operation Bloomin' Onion because most of that slavery was in onion picking on farms near Vidalia, Georgia. And a lot of those Vidalia onions go to the Bloomin' Onion appetizer at Outback Steakhouse. So, Operation Bloomin' Onion. When I was working with this farm, we'll call it Greg's Farms, back in 2016, their crew lead kept telling me about their hiring program and how it was really different from all the other onion farms around there. Not like in a look at how perfect we are, virtue signaling kind of way. He was just the employee who had busted his butt putting it together. It was his baby, and he wanted to show it off like proud dad style. It was really cute. So here's what they did over at Greg's Farm and why it was different. So here in the United States, the guest visa program for farm workers is called H-2A. You've heard of undocumented workers. H-2A is the document. It's the visa that guest workers are supposed to have. Most U.S. farmers, when they hire H-2A workers, hire them through a labor contractor. A labor contractor is just another word for a temp agency, basically, that specializes in farm crews. Because if you hire H-2A workers yourself as a farm, you have to do a lot of paperwork to qualify to hire those documented guest workers. But if you rent them through a temp agency, then the temp agency does all that paperwork for you, and it's so convenient. However, some labor contractors, these temp agencies for farm work, also just run themselves like human traffickers. Some of them do that. The labor contractors in this case, who were busted in the Georgia onion fields, were taking workers' passports, forcing them to work at gunpoint, and holding them prisoner when they weren't working in filthy little shacks. Totally normal temp agency behavior, right? Greg's Farm knew that that was how their neighbors were getting workers. And the Greg said, listen, we're a family farm, and our neighbors doing this are also family farms. That's why they think that if they get caught working people on their farms like slaves, they can pull the, but I'm just a little family farm card. And they think they won't get into trouble. But it's still wrong. We're just not going to do that. Using a labor contractor in this area, we feel that that's just paying a middleman extra money to do crimes. So forget labor contractors. We're just going to hire H-2A workers ourselves. That's what Greg's Farm did. I'd like to take a quick moment, by the way, to walk through exactly how picking crews work, because I feel like for a lot of Americans at least, as soon as you say manual field labor, we just start hearing banjos. Relax. It's not that weird. We're not teleporting into a John Steinbeck novel here. I might be biased because I've worked on pick crews before, so to me it's just a normal job. It is hard on your body, yeah. So are construction, nursing, a lot, picking up garbage. A lot of jobs are hard on your body. Most of the things that can make manual field labor really rough come from individual bosses being jerks, which means it's just like every other job. So I can't stress this enough. Picking crops is not exotic. It's just picking up fruits and vegetables in one place and then you walk over and put them down somewhere else. We don't got to overthink that part of it. The part that we do tend to underthink about pick crews is being the person who hires them. So now let's talk about that. If you are a farmer that needs to hire a pick crew, how do you make that happen? Hiring people is real work. You got to find enough people who are down to do the job, handle payroll. You've got to make sure the crew has water and a first aid kit and knows which field to go to and where to take the crop after they pick it. And you got to make sure there are bathrooms and that they're clean and have toilet paper and running water and soap. Hosting crews to work on a farm is a real job. That's why a lot of farms don't want to deal with crews. That's why so many farms stick with crops that can be harvested by machine. That's part of why some crops make so much more money than others. You have to hire people to do it, and a lot of farms don't want to hire people. It's just a hassle that they don't want to deal with. For farms that do hire pick crews, a lot of them just use a labor contractor. So instead of having, as the farm, to handle hiring, payroll, housing, supervising, you just call up a labor contractor and say, hey, I need 20 guys for 3 weeks starting in mid-September. So if you're a farm that hires a picking crew, all that hiring is a job somebody has to do. Somebody who has to hire the workers or at least hire a labor contractor who's going to do that for you. That person who does all that hiring is usually a family member, sometimes an employee. And then during the picking season, you make sure that you have enough people every day. Okay, so that's your baseline with having a crew come and pick your crops. But the Greg's Farm said, we've got to do one better. We need to do all that baseline level work of hosting a crew during picking season, sure. Since we're hiring people ourselves and getting their visas ourselves, then there's even more work to do before the picking season starts, right? We need someone to do the visa applications. We need to get some housing built on our own property so that when a crew is working for us, we know that they get to eat and sleep and do their laundry somewhere decent and clean. We need someone at our farm to go in person down to the consulate of Mexico, charter a bus, pick up our crew, and drive them to Georgia, because if we hire someone else to do it, they will mess with the workers. They might demand money. They might take their passports and only give it back when they get a bribe, things like that. So the Greg's Farm said, we can't leave anywhere in the food chain for labor contractors, coyotes, etc., to get in there and harass our crew and take their money that we're paying them. When people are taking our workers' money, they're also kind of taking our money and making it harder for us to pay people a fair wage. So to cut all that nonsense out, we have to do that work ourselves. Now I want to stop and highlight here that strictly from a business point of view, labor contractors and traffickers, anywhere on that spectrum, they are taking a big bite of the money. They push up farms' labor costs, sometimes by a lot. Labor contractors can't offer a lot of convenience. All that work I was just talking about, if someone else does does it for you, that's great. That's a ton of convenience. It can be very attractive to have someone else do that for you. But there's also a big financial price to pay for it, on top of the moral one if they're doing crimes while they're at it. Doing your own hiring is more work, but it can also take a huge financial burden off a farm. So, long story short, Greg's farm did so much extra work to hire their own crews instead of farming that out to labor contractors. Now here is how it paid off. After a couple years of doing all this, Greg's farm got a really good reputation as employers down in Mexico. So they got their pick of workers and people would come back every year. So their crews were experienced people with a lot of practice doing a pick exactly the way the Gregs do it. That saves a lot of time on training and orientation. So the Greg's farm invested extra time and work up front, but it saved a lot of money on labor contractor fees, on rent putting their crew up somewhere else. And they also saved a lot of time not having to get a brand new crew settled in every single year. And in 2021, there was an added benefit. The Greg's farm also kind of got the Vidalia onion market to themselves for a while because all their neighbors' labor contractors got busted for doing a slavery. Their neighbors just didn't have anyone to pick for a while. And that is a great way to have your crop just rot in the field. Now, when I tell the story about Greg's farm to people in agriculture, people often respond with something like, but this Greg's farm, they just had a lot of money, right? They were big, rich farmers, and that's why they could afford to run their own H-2A visa program. To which I say, yeah, that's the point I'm making. This is a story about how treating a farm like a real business gives you the financial breathing room to run it right. And don't forget, they had to become big, fancy onion farmers somehow. They did not start out that way. It came from decades of legwork. Most farms will grow something, sell it to a wholesaler, and call it a day. The Greggs said they were starting out with 5 acres of onions. They said, we've only got 5 acres, so wholesale is not going to cut it. Wholesale tends to pay less than retail. When you're selling to a middleman, that's wholesale versus when you're selling it straight to the customer, that's retail. The customer is going to pay you more money than the wholesaler is. Because the wholesaler then has to turn it around and sell it to other people. There's some cost to that. They're not going to pay you as much. What the Greggs farm did to cope with that, the mom of the family started doing mail order sweet onions. That was the online business of its time back in 1982, back when that was a lot more work than it is today. Selling a few pounds of product at a time through the mail was a very weird thing for a farm to do in 1982. But since they didn't have a middleman or a wholesaler taking a cut, the Greggs got paid way more per pound of onions that they sold direct through the mail. They could start building a viable business, even though they didn't have a ton of acreage. They took their farm seriously as a business, even when it was tiny. Their family made Vidalia sweet onions a national level brand. They did a lot of the work that made Vidalia onions a household name now, and they kept grinding on that for decades to get where they are now. Now that the Vidalia onion brand is a thing, they've also got some neighbors following along and cashing in on that name recognition. And that's fine. But a lot of those neighbors didn't put in that same legwork to build that market. They might be growing the same crop, but they didn't necessarily grow the same skill set or mindset that came along with it of taking their farms seriously as a business. And they may not have built the same financial strength that comes from decades of carefully and attentively building something yourself. And that led a lot of those neighbors to take shortcuts. Good intentions can only take you so far. To run a good farm, you got to put your money where your mouth is. And that means you got to have money. That's why I believe that if you want to run a good farm, it better be a profitable farm. It doesn't have to turn a profit right away. Good business usually takes years of investment before it turns a real living. That's normal. But it's good to have a plan for how to get to profitability within your lifetime. It doesn't have to be big to be profitable either, but you do have to take yourself seriously as a business because good intentions will only get you so far. You've got to back those intentions up with action and with resources. Now, let's talk about another farm that also hits way above their weight. That is the Chilton Orchard in Washington State. The Chiltons didn't launch a big national brand or a niche product like Vidalia sweet onions. They're in a big orchard area, and they mostly grow the same fruit trees as the rest of their neighbors. Instead of building their business around a single niche product and really blowing it up on the national market the way the Griggs did, the Chiltons mostly just grew normal stuff, same as their neighbors, on a farm that stayed pretty small. They just grew the same things everybody else was growing really well and sold them really well. Here's a little background on what's been going on in their neighborhood and why the Chiltons were doing it differently. You know Red Delicious apples? You know how they used to be good and then over a few decades they turned into sad purple styrofoam balls? So the Chiltons were farming in the middle of all that, where the sad purple foam ball Red Delicious apples come from. A lot of people think those gross Red Delicious apples must have been coming from corporate mega farms, but no, they were mostly coming from family orchards. A lot of these families kind of liked having most of their land in one variety because most of your property would ripen all at once, so they didn't have to deal with picking crews for very long. And then you could just kind of sell your whole crop at once to wholesalers who would deal with all those annoying, expensive parts of the supply chain. Those parts of the supply chain include storing the apples all winter and spring and into the next summer. Those wholesale buyers are the ones who have those big controlled atmosphere warehouses that hold all those apples all winter long. The orchards that were growing the gross Red Delicious apples were almost entirely family owned. Most of them were small or medium sized too. Even the controlled atmosphere warehouses were usually a family operation. There's not a corporation with shareholders in most cases for those kinds of operations in agriculture. So anyway, that's what normal looked like where the Chiltons were farming. And when I met them, the public was already over Red Delicious. Most families had already converted most of their orchards into Gala or Gala, different orchard regions say it differently, and Honeycrisp and a few other of the newer apple varieties, plus cherries and maybe some peaches and nectarines and apricots. Most of those family orchards sold most of their fruit through big wholesalers. Because the thinking is, well, I'm just a small family farm, right? I've got a day job. I can't be on the phone all day selling my crop. And an acre of orchard can easily yield 10,000 pounds of fruit. So even with a small farm, selling and shipping it all away before it goes bad gets really overwhelming really fast. So a lot of family operations want to just keep it simple and get their product immediately out the door after harvest. Middlemen are expensive, but they will just take it all from you and get it off your property. So I want to be clear, there are a lot of times when having a middleman like a wholesale buyer or a broker is the right call. But that's what everybody in Mike and Carol's Valley was doing. Just because everybody's doing it doesn't mean you have to, right? So the Chiltons came up with their own plan. A lot of the Chiltons' neighbors planted their orchards with trees that would come ripe in 1 or 2 big harvests per year that would last about 6 weeks. One in the fall for apples, another in the spring or summer for cherries. Now that fits great with the just take it all away from me approach, right? You keep your crazy harvest seasons as short as possible and get back to your day job. Mike and Carol went all the way in the opposite direction. Mike and Carol made their busy season last all spring, summer, and fall on purpose. They had blueberries, which ripen pretty early in the summer, and then they had early cherries, then middle and late season cherries, peaches and nectarines, then apples and pears in fall. And that made a huge difference. Mike and Carol started with less than 10 acres of orchard. Mike actually got his start in agriculture picking fruit for other people, not growing up on a farm. So he came into agriculture with that firsthand knowledge of what a big difference it makes to manage your labor well. And he was right. By the time I met Mike and Carol, they were running 65 acres. If that ripens all at once, 300 tons of fruit coming at you all in one shot. But because they spread it out over 6 months instead of 6 weeks, that kept the flow manageable. That meant they got about 10 or 15 tons of ripe fruit per week. 10 or 15 tons a week can sound like a lot, but 1 ton is about 1 pallet. 10 or 15 pallets in a week, you can move that yourself with hand trucks. You don't need forklifts or a big cooling facility. So with the very small crew, Carol was able to pack and ship all of their product every single week from a tiny little barn about the size of a 2-car garage. They put their own name and brand on the packaging, and they made sure that everything they sold was top quality. They got a good reputation, and they could sell everything they wanted to at a really good price. Carol made the sales and handled the shipments herself, so they didn't have a middleman taking the cut. And that meant the Chiltons and their workers could get paid more. Having a long season of steady work also meant that the Chiltons, working there was a way better deal for fruit pickers than neighboring farms, for reasons beyond hourly pay. Being a migrant fruit picker means you usually have to move and find a new job at least once a month. That stinks. You're losing at least a day's worth of work. You're driving all over the place. You have to keep a car running. It's a really expensive job to have. As a farm worker, if you find a farm run by sane, normal people who want to keep you around for 6 months at a time, that's gold. And that's what the Chiltons did. They would run the farm with a pretty small crew of long-term dedicated staff. Hiring differently like that helped the Chiltons become one of the first farms in their area to get certified organic. Organic takes a little bit of extra work all year long, and the Chiltons could afford to do that because they had very experienced staff. Organic certification then helped their prices even more. We are so used to thinking of business as a vicious cycle, and it certainly can be, but it doesn't have to be. That's a choice. And we as business owners have so much freedom to make different choices. The Chiltons were able to do all that because they didn't shy away from the fact that what they were doing was a business. They embraced it and they leaned all the way into that responsibility. That's the responsibility of building your own reputation and revenue stream, the responsibility of being an employer, and most of all, the responsibility of just being there all season long to run the business. Instead of saying, ugh, I have to get back to my day job, they said, how do we make this farm into our day job? And that did not happen overnight. It took years, if not decades, and I'm sure it was a real slog for them sometimes, but they had a vision and they got it done. Before we close out, here's my favorite part of the Chiltons business model. The Chiltons wanted to stretch out their picking season as long as possible, right? So one way they did that was growing an apple called Pink Lady. It ripens late. I mean, late. Some apples will start ripening in August, but Pink Lady wasn't ready for them to pick until November. That was perfect for the Chiltons because it picks so late, it stays fresh long into the winter without all that expensive controlled atmosphere storage the Chiltons didn't have. So if you're a small farm that doesn't have a lot of high-end warehouse capacity, but you still want to sell your crops as close to year-round as possible, Pink Lady is your best friend. Part of why it's so popular at grocery stores as well. A lot of the Chiltons' neighbors didn't want to grow Pink Lady, and you're going to love the reason why. Pink Lady is so late. By the time you're done picking it, there will be no deer hunting season left. And their neighbors just really wanted to go hunting with the boys, so they didn't plant Pink Lady. And that's a perfectly fine and valid lifestyle choice. But it is a terrible business decision, objectively, a bad business decision. To free up time for hunting, their neighbors planted apples that finished ripening before it got too late in the fall. That kept them on the middleman treadmill. It pushed them towards growing crops that kind of ripen all at once, so they had to keep selling through middlemen with the big storage facilities. And that cut into their profits. And the next generation could not afford to stay on the farm. And that's why the Chiltons are one of, if not the last, independent family farms in their valley. And I don't know what to say about that. I hope those bucks were worth it, y'all. To start wrapping it up, I think a lot of us have been taught to believe that it's bad and evil and scary to think about farms as a business. And that can be a big mental hurdle to move past. If it helps, here's something I've noticed in my career in agriculture. The less a farmer thinks of themselves as a business, the more they're going to rely on middlemen. Because middlemen take care of all that fiddly, annoying, and often painful business stuff for you. That fear of acting like a real business keeps us farmers dependent on middlemen. And that always hurts us in the long run. And it kills farms all the time. So if and when those worries about treating a farm like a business crop up, that's okay. Stop, take a deep breath, eat a sandwich, ask yourself, who does this worry serve? Does it serve people who need good jobs? No. Does it serve people who need good food? No. Does it help your local economy for you to be barely limping along? Listen, man, I don't know your local neighborhood, but probably not. And does it serve you to be afraid of doing the legwork it takes to build a proper business? Almost certainly not. So in conclusion, do not be afraid that running a real business will blow up your life. Be afraid that not running a real business will blow up your life because you have to cut corners to stay afloat when you're not making money. And insolvent farms are farms that get sold to developers. Those are the biggest risks facing farms, at least in my experience. So now you know, let's get out there and stay alive another day. Shout out to Patreon supporters. This video is possible because of you. A lot of what I do is helping farmers save money by doing things themselves instead of hiring middlemen and buying inputs. So sponsorships are really not in the cards for me. Thank you, Patreon folks, for helping me do what I do. You're wonderful. This video would not exist without you. If you'd like to help support good farm info and get behind the scenes updates and bonus content, my Patreon is linked in the description. I am very looking forward to professionalizing this whole situation, and every little bit really does help. And the standard call of the YouTuber, if you like this enough to still be watching, please share, hit like, hit subscribe so the algorithm knows people like this and helps more people find it. Okay, have a good day.